With Tears of the Kingdom releasing in a little over a month, I've seen Breath of the Wild discourse return to the internet, and I wanted to discuss one particular aspect of that discourse. Specifically, the part that has people say, while Breath of the Wild is a good video game, it is not a good Zelda game. This statement has always been wild to me. Hypothetically, any game that is good and also a Zelda game would be a good Zelda game by default, right? Well, apparently not, and what I want to find out is what exactly people mean when they say this. Now, some people of course just think it's a bad game in general, but this viewpoint is less interesting to me, so in this video we will treat it as a given that it is generally a good game. The Legend of Zelda mainline games have always been, including Breath of the Wild, incredibly consistent in their branding over the decades. You have recurring characters like Link, Princess Zelda, Ganon, Impa, Tingle, and Epona. Races like the Hylian, Goron, and the Zora. The games have melee focused combat with a lot of recurring items like the Master Sword, Hylian Shield, heart pieces, rupees, hookshots, and boomerangs. The Hyrule region itself, with its shrines and dungeons and shared enemy types, appear in many mainline games as well. Almost all of these elements are also included in Breath of the Wild to one extent or another. It is clearly recognizable as a Zelda game to anyone who is familiar with the other mainline titles. But for some people, this is not enough. It is not enough Zelda, as Joseph Anderson says in his video. While he makes a lot of substantial points about the quality of the game's content, he still echoes that very sentiment about it not being a good Zelda game, and I find that utterly fascinating. It seems that in order for a Zelda game to not just be good, but specifically for it to be a good Zelda game, it needs to adhere to a very specific kind of formula. The biggest difference between Breath of the Wild and previous Zelda games isn't really what is included. It is more about game structure and proportions. It focuses less on dungeons and instead centers exploration and discovery. While those things have always been part of the series, they've never been as central to the game's core as they are here. It has all of the elements that generally make up a Zelda game, but it feels very different to play. But is that enough for it to be a bad Zelda game? Is this actually good criticism? To give you another example, let's briefly talk about Mass Effect Andromeda. To me, this is a game in identity crisis. It wants to be a modern open-world action game, and at the same time, it is also trying to be a more traditional Mass Effect RPG. And it does both pretty poorly. It feels like the developers had two visions that were turned into one mediocre mess of a game. But ultimately, this is still one finished product. It isn't possible for me to judge the Mass Effect part separately because both visions are unified in the final game. Because of this, I can only judge it as one experience. It is a bad Mass Effect game, but only because it is a Mass Effect game and it is also a bad game. However, I don't think I would say this if Andromeda was an amazing open world game. The fact that it tries to change its formula alone doesn't inherently make it a bad Mass Effect game. Let's return to Breath of the Wild though. I think it's clearly a different situation. It's not just a traditional Zelda game shoehorned into an open world. It has its own unique vision of how an open world game should look and feel. And by doing that, it ironically represents the original spirit of The Legend of Zelda much more accurately than any game released since then. But it seems that to some, it is more important that it follows a specific formula of games they have enjoyed in the past. And since the developers have cultivated a fandom around a certain type of game, they need to continue serving that fanbase. I don't agree with that take at all. I think it is important for game series to evolve and for developers to be given the chance to be creative with existing IPs. Of course, I'm disappointed when a game series becomes less attractive to me, but I don't think that alone is legitimate criticism against the game. Another example of that happening was the Resident Evil 3 remake. That game's significantly less scary than the remake of RE2, but it's still an excellent horror shooter. It isn't even trying to provide the same experience as RE2. I feel like that game hasn't been received as well in part because of expectations set by the RE2 remake. Instead of being judged as its own piece of art, it is, by some, perceived as a game that failed at being the Resident Evil 2 remake. That is not to say that everyone has to like it, or be a fan of Breath of the Wild for that matter. To many people, the more linear approaches of past Zelda games have simply been more appealing than a sandbox-style open world. But I honestly don't think it's deeper than that. There's no need to rationalize that disappointment by pretending it's criticism. And I think it's worth remembering that the more linear style was already a pretty big deviation from the original Legend of Zelda, meaning that without the developers experimenting with the formula, the good Zelda games of the past wouldn't have ever existed in the first place. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more good takes, join my Discord to keep the takes going, and see you next time.